Hi, I'm Tom Birkeland, author of An Introduction to the Policy Process and professor of public policy at North Carolina State University. I hope you enjoy the book, and I hope you find these videos useful.
Well, welcome back. The last video was about the historical eras of public policy making in the United States, which helps us to put our current policy environment into context. This video is about public policy in the constitutional order, and is really about how our constitutional system, which is the Constitution and all the things that derive from it, the laws, the norms, the political culture, all relate to the making of public policy and help shape the kind of public policies that are made in the United States. So let's take a look. Well, let's talk about the changing constitutional order in American history and pick up on some of the themes that discussed in the earlier video. And the first of those themes is that much of the constitutional order has changed a great deal since the founding, but much of our constitutional structure is stable. And as you know from the prior video, the separation of powers, federalism, the rule of law, a commitment to individual liberty, and the sanctity of private property, and the idea of civil rights are all important features of our constitutional system. It doesn't mean that they've been the same throughout the last 240 years, but that they all play a role in the making of public policy because they play a role in politics. Well, let's talk about public policy in the Constitution. And the passage of the Constitution that I always suggest people look at is Article 1, Section 8, which is a list of all the powers Congress has. And there's all kinds of different powers in here, like the ability to raise an army, to coin money, to create a system of patents and copyrights, to set up post offices. Look for those things in Article 1, Section 8. In fact, at this point, I should say, read the American Constitution, read the United States Constitution, and if you have time, read your state's Constitution. Chances are your state's Constitution is going to be longer than the US Constitution, but it's not a terribly difficult document to read, although at times it might be difficult to understand how is it understood in practice right now. But the big question on Article 1, Section 8, listing all the things that Congress has the power to do, and in particular, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, gives the power to Congress to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. And that's really central to a lot of federal policy making. But does this limit Congress's power? In other words, does Congress only have the powers listed in Article 1, Section 8? Well, the last clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, says that Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So it basically says that there are all these things that Congress can do and that they have the power to make laws to carry out those things. But is this list a list of only the powers Congress has? And a question that people often have in considering the role of the federal government in particular is whether the federal government goes beyond the Constitution's mandate. Does the federal government seek to do more than what the Constitution says it can do? I'll give you an example. Some years ago, Congress tried to establish laws that would set up gun-free school zones, and they justified it on Commerce Clause grounds by saying that kids in school are going to be engaging in a national and global economy, and therefore they're engaged in interstate commerce. And the courts didn't accept that. The Supreme Court did not accept that as a rationale. They said that, that's going a little bit too far with this Commerce Clause idea, so that the courts looked like they might be starting to trim the powers of the federal government, especially expressive legislation, to do various things because it goes beyond what appears to be the boundaries set by Article 1, Section 8. This is a question for you to decide for yourself whether or not you think that the government at the federal level does more than what's mandated by the federal government. But now I want to talk about stability in the federal constitutional order. And there are several reasons that James Anderson, a well-known political scientist who wrote for years on public policy, developed a set of reasons for stability in public policymaking in the United States would suggest that policymaking in the United States is not quick, but it's generally stable for a number of reasons, including ideological and political stability, political fragmentation in the United States, which makes it difficult for everybody to get in line on every policy. You're not going to get complete agreement everywhere all the time. Basic rules and norms in our system, a system of open government and policy restraint, which means that people can broadly participate in our government, but all these other features and open participation in government yield a system characterized by what Robertson and Judd called policy restraint. So, what are some of the features of ideological and political stability in the United States? We believe generally in America in small limited government, or at least in small limited actions. Big giant leaps forward are fairly rare in American history. You can probably count on one hand, maybe one and a half hands, the times in which there have been huge shifts in federal policy, like the New Deal or the Great Society, perhaps, or the Civil War. That's only three. In most cases, most policy change in the United States is fairly small. In chapter 11, you'll learn about something called punctuated equilibrium theory that argues that most policy in the United States remains very stable, except for sudden shocks to systems which lead to new policy, what we call stick slip dynamics in policy, that the status quo is pretty sticky until something causes change to happen all of a sudden. But even then, if taken together, most actions taken by government are usually fairly small and reasonably incremental rather than major shifts. But when those major shifts happen, we want to understand under what conditions were those possible. Now, another feature of our political and ideological stability is the notion of free enterprise and the protection of private property. I've said that more than once between this video and the one before, but it's really important to keep in mind that this notion of public property, private property, I mean, really suffuses kind of the economic underpinnings of the Constitution. The constitutional system, many have argued, basically structures a society in which people are free to do what they want with their property. In other words, free to engage in private enterprise and private action. Another feature of our ideological and political stability in the United States has been a less emphasis on class-based political organization in the United States than in other countries such as Europe. We don't have a party that's called the Labor Policy. We don't have parties on the extreme left or extreme right, honestly, although the Republican Party has probably moved right in the last several years, and to some extent the Democratic Party might have moved slightly left, but by and large, the ideological movement in the United States has been to the right, and in most cases, that hasn't been a far right movement any more than we have a far left government in the United States. But the lack of sort of class-based political organization yields a distinctive policy type in the United States, or policy style, which doesn't really rely on socioeconomic class the way that appeals in, say, European politics often do. So we're different in a lot of ways, and that helps explain why ideologically and politically the United States has remained very stable. We're working under the same Constitution that we've had for the last 240 years, and I would argue that we're working under a system that's largely remained intact since the 1930s, which is interesting when you compare it with a country like France, which has had several constitutional changes, and other countries that have had brand new constitutions or wholesale changes to their constitutional structure, or in fact that have lost wars like Japan and Germany, and that are operating under a post-war constitution that was very different than what existed pre-war. So the United States, compared to other countries, is ideologically and politically pretty stable. Now, basic rules and norms are also a feature of our political system. And I don't think I'm as clear as I could be on this point in the book, but here's what I mean by this. Our political institutions have a set of norms under which politics are conducted, norms of what we call comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y. There are norms in Congress that suggest that you shouldn't call people names or insult your fellow members of Congress. And in fact, the Congress of the United States, right before the Civil War, was a pretty raucous organization because there was such polarization between the South and the North over issues like slavery. After the war, there was a tendency to try to avoid that level of sort of rancor between members of Congress, and you will see in the day-to-day conduct of business in Congress that there are some norms that attempt to reduce conflict to some extent in Congress. But we also have norms in our political institutions such as the presidency, a norm that has been broken in the last several years to the discomfort, I think, of a lot of people, is the idea of the president as sort of national leader and consoler in chief. We expect to hear from the president when things are going bad, and we expect to hear the president tell us how things are going to get better. I'm not sure that, particularly in the COVID pandemic, that this is a role that Donald Trump filled or was particularly comfortable filling. And that changes a little bit, I think, expectations around the behavior of the president in our system. But all of our political institutions have a set of sort of norms, rules, things like that are used to help structure the way business is done in a way that's orderly and in a way that reduces political conflict to the greatest possible extent. And related to that is the norms under which politics is conducted in the United States. We have laws. There are some laws about things like campaign contributions and things like that. But by and large, the norms of political discourse in the United States have tended to look askance at overt insults of other candidates, of making invidious comparisons between people, things like that. And a lot of these norms have been violated in the last 4 years. The President of the United States has on occasion made statements that suggest at best a lack of understanding of the history of white supremacy in the United States, and at worst a political alignment with some people who would be characterized as white supremacists. Whether or not that makes the president a white supremacist is for you to decide. But some of these norms have been shattered. But I will note that the president-elect at the time of this recording, by the time you see this, he might be the president, Joe Biden. It appears to be returning to the old norms of behavior that we expect from presidents. So we'll see whether the last 4 years have been an anomaly or whether a new set of norms around the presidency have been created. If, in fact, it's the former, that it's an anomaly, then I think we can still say that the basic norms are being observed in American politics. Now, fragmentation is a really important feature of American politics and policymaking, because power in the United States is divided among 3 branches of government, among 2 political parties, by and large, and 50 states. Each of them have 3 branches of government. So if you think about it, there are 51 governments, or, well, there's actually 99 houses of the legislature in the United States. Nebraska uniquely has a unicameral legislature. They only have 1 body, but the other states have 2 bodies like the federal government. And then you have 2 parties by and large in each state. So you can see how things start to divide up a little bit. And then, like I said, 50 states, and then over 80,000 local governments, school districts, public utility districts, water districts, all kinds of different things, counties, of course, cities, towns. All of those have an important role in government. Just think of the number of school districts there are, and think how complex that system of providing education can be. And then there are thousands of interest groups, citizen groups, and things like that. And the consequence might be that it's hard to get some things done. If we have to have agreement on the federal, state, and local level on issues like managing crime or providing education or protecting the environment, you can see where the difficulties might come in implementing legislation, which is why new legislation may be more incremental than revolutionary in terms of what government plans to do. We'll get into this more when we talk about policy and implementation later in this book, because policy implementation is very difficult in a context of fragmentation. Now, in this table, table 3.2 in the book, I wanted to illustrate how the powers, the 3 powers, the legislative, the executive, and judicial powers, are both shared and are separate. And That's a subtle difference. A lot of us talk about the separation of powers, like that there's this clear delineation between the powers of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. But as you see in Table 3.2, that's really not the case. That the legislative branch has a role in making laws. In fact, it is the law-making branch. But the president also has a legislative role by, for example, recommending laws. The Constitution says that the president can recommend laws to Congress. The president can veto a law, says, I don't want that law, I'm going to veto that. That's part of the legislative process. The executive branch makes regulations that have the force of law, which is a quasi-legislative action. The president also gets involved, the executive branch also gets involved in judicial matters, such as nominating judges or pardoning criminals. So the president has a role in the judicial function, even though the prime mover in the judicial function is the courts under our constitutional system. On the other hand, the courts do review laws to determine legislative intent and to interpret them. In other words, the courts make laws. And if you ever hear anybody say that the courts shouldn't make laws, they should simply interpret them, that demonstrates what I would argue is a fundamental a misinterpretation of the judicial role, that interpreting laws is a form of lawmaking, and that's a form of lawmaking that is clearly delineated for the judicial branch in our constitutional system. Now, Congress gets involved in the judicial process by impeaching judges or in the president, but that's almost like a judicial function, like an impeachment trial for a president, calling witnesses in hearings to testify about things. But Congress also gets involved in the judicial branch by approving the nomination of judges. That's something I should have put in that chart. But Congress does, well, the Senate, not the entire Congress, but the Senate, under its advice and consent power, approves executive nominations, both to the judicial branch and to the executive branch. So when Congress votes whether or not somebody can be appointed a cabinet secretary or a member of a court, they're getting involved in executive and legislative branch functions. I think you can see that this table reflects how the founders wanted the three branches to have a role in each other's business so as to serve as the check and balance that we hear so much about in our fundamental courses on American politics. Now, there's a rationale for stability. The question is, why is stability in policy making a good thing? And the positive argument for stability is that it makes for a predictable government that doesn't swing wildly between elections, so that people can have a certain degree of certainty that the government is going to work a particular way. Thought of it another way, you can think of stability as and our system of government that works against rapid change, as meaning that when a change happens, it's likely to have broad support in a number of ways. Think about all the ways that the constitutional order slows legislative or policy progress. For a law to be enacted, for example, it has to be introduced in both houses of Congress, has to be passed by both bodies, has to be approved by the president, has to be implemented by the executive branch. There's a lot of different people involved, in other words. And then, even more to the point, people have to accept the policy once it's been put into effect. So there's a lot of opportunities to block policy change in the United States. And the founders would argue that this is a good thing, that we want to balance popular will, in other words, the immediate needs of the moment, with a set of constitutional limits or safeguards to protect government from getting too big, because after all, the founders were concerned about the creation of an overbearing or even tyrannical government, because that's what they had revolted against during the American Revolution. So stability might be a good thing, but you've got to ask yourself too, how might our stability impede progress? There's all kinds of problems that we might have. So how are the features that promote stability in policymaking in the United States and a barrier to progress on things like, say, environmental regulation or equal rights for women or ethnic and racial minorities? And ask yourself, do you think Americans prefer stability or change? And this might be kind of a trick question because it probably depends on how you raise the question with people and what the nature of that change is. During our periods of history in the United States, there have been support for major change and opposition to that change. I don't think that most Americans want everything to be just the way it is all the time. But I think a lot of Americans are also wary of sudden, rapid change, and the kind of changes that would erode the sort of basic features of our constitutional order, like I talked about, civil and political liberties, private property, things like that. Those are very unlikely to get much traction in American public policy, which is another reason we can say that American policymaking is relatively stable. So here's some final points to take into account as you think about the constitutional order. The first of those points is that our Constitution is a framework. It's not an absolute set of rules for the government to follow. Is a set of guidelines, and they matter. I mean, it's not just that they're good ideas and that they're things people should do. The courts will interpret the Constitution to say this is what it means, but the interpretation of the Constitution has changed over 200 years in which we've had the United States Constitution. So it is a document, a living document that changes not only in terms of amendments to the Constitution, but also in the way the courts and other branches of government interpret its meaning and implications for public policy. So think of it as a framework, and think of the Constitution as the document and all the judicial decisions that have followed that interpret the documents. So you can't think of the Constitution just as the words on the page. Also think about decisions like Brown versus Board of Education that made it illegal for schools to segregate on the basis of race in the schools. Or think about decisions like Roe versus Wade, which largely prohibited the states from restricting access to abortion in the first trimester of pregnancy. Those kinds of cases, along with the Constitution, are taken together, really define the constitutional order in the United States. But another thing to keep in mind about our constitutional order from a public policy perspective is that the system is somewhat democratic in design, but it's not wholly democratic in design. And think about the ways in which our system is democratic and ways in which it is not. It's clearly got some democratic features, such as we vote for president, we vote for members of the House and Senate. On the other hand, the House of Representatives, of course, represents districts that are by and large about the same size population wise, whereas the Senate, every state gets 2 senators. So Wyoming gets as many senators as California, even though California is a far bigger state than Wyoming. And is that democratic? Of course, the existence of the Senate was due to a compromise that was made when the Constitution was created so that smaller states didn't feel overwhelmed by bigger states. But does this mean then that the smaller states in our union, smaller, less populated states that may be primarily rural, have a veto power over those larger, more urban states? That's an important question that a lot of people are asking about our system now. And while there's probably no appetite for just shredding the Constitution and starting over, that is something that we want to think about. How is that anti-democratic? The founders wanted to strike a balance between popular will and sort of constitutional and political limits. And to some extent, the Senate fulfills the role as a limit in how national policy can be developed and implemented. So is our system truly democratic? And has it ever been? And what are some of those undemocratic features of our system? And does it matter for public policy that our system is not fully democratic? I don't have all the answers to this. These are normative questions, but I do hope you take them into account because especially after the last 4 years, questions about what it means to be a democracy, what our constitutional and democratic norms and values are something that we should be thinking about pretty carefully. What kind of country do we want to be? And if we're not fully democratic, what features of our system could change to be more democratic? And what features of our system are those that we want to keep as they are to prevent sudden lurches or sudden changes in public policy. So I hope you found that interesting and useful. I'm fascinated by the constitutional history of the United States. For fun, I read books about, particularly about Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, because it had incredible constitutional implications both before and after the war. Like many of you who are thinking about going to law school, at one point I thought about going to law school. I was thinking about becoming a lawyer. Towards the end of college, I decided I didn't want to go in that direction. But had I become an attorney, my interest was in appellate law and constitutional law. Maybe if I'd stuck with it, I would have been a law professor. Who knows? But I used to teach courses in civil rights, constitutional law, the Supreme Court, things like that. So I think it's fascinating because it's such an interesting part of our history with just these incredibly interesting historical figures that developed and created what at the time was a brand new system of government. Nothing had ever been seen like the United States. And it's an amazing thing that the basic outlines of our system of government have persisted for over 240 years. So I think this is useful context for you as you start delving into the policy process. I hope you find it useful, and I hope you continue to explore the ideas in this chapter in your studies as you go further into the study of public policy.
Thanks for watching this video. As always, I really enjoy hearing from students and teachers about the book and about public policy. Feel free to reach out to me at tom@tomberkland.com or visit my website, tomberkland.com. Thanks again for watching.